Meanwhile, Alfgeir was pouring water over Algar's face to revive him. His best friend had a nasty-looking bruise over his temple and his eyes were opening rather sluggishly. Algar blinked up at Alfgeir for a few seconds before attempting to sit up. When he did, he wished that Alfgeir had left him alone. He looked on as the members of the Bear Brothers shouted and cheered while his furmates were sullen and downcast. "I lost," said Algar, unable to believe it. "By a sheer fluke of luck," said Alfgeir. "But I had him," said Algar, "I had him." "I know you did," replied Alfgeir as he stood up and pulled Algar to his feet. "But it doesn't matter anymore. The outcome of the Holmgang is final. The Heart Lancers are no more." Algar looked on. He was crushed. He had had a chance to exact justice upon the vile cheater. He could have shown everyone who truly deserved victory, but he had forfeited his chance. He had bungled his only opportunity for revenge. He looked on and saw Crest. The bastard son of a swine was actually smiling. This was too much. Algar fell to his knees and uttered such a scream of enraged shame that Alfgeir jumped back several feet. His cry was lost amid the din of the cheering and whooping. Algar let his tears fall. What was the point of holding them back anymore? He felt as though the world had turned against him. He saw Crest through the crowd and saw that he wasn't paying any attention to him at all. And why should he? He thought as he glared at his hated rival, "I'm nothing more than a failure." He felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to see Alfgeir standing next to him. "Take heart, old friend," he said, "it was a good fight while it lasted." Algar could only nod in reply as he rose to his feet. He looked at the faces of his furmates and saw his grief and shame mirrored in them. They too were filled with the anguish of defeat. Then Algar noticed something. The boys had separated into two groups. Crest's band and his were separated by a 10-foot wide gap. The members of the Bear Brothers were too busy cheering to take any notice of them. Algar looked back at his fur and sensed the anger building up in the air. They wanted revenge. They wanted to wipe away the shame. They wanted to act on their rage. They were all still holding their wooden weapons and round shields. Algar looked back at Alfgeir and a wicked smile cracked itself across his livid face. "We're not done yet, old friend," he sneered. Alfgeir went pale. He had known Algar long enough to know what he intended to do, and he also knew that there was no chance of dissuading him. Once Algar determined to do something, there was no stopping him. He was going to defy the verdict of the Holmgang. It would mean the ruination of his honor and his reputation, but Alfgeir knew that Algar didn't care about that. Once again his friend had been blinded by his anger. "Your anger will be the death of you, Algar," thought Alfgeir. Algar picked up his wooden sword and battered shield and looked back at his fur mates. A silent message was spoken among them, and in an instant the whole of the Heart Lancer knew Algar's intentions. They nodded their approval to their chieftain, their true chieftain. They would never accept Crest as their new leader, and they would show it. Algar gazed into the crowd and glared hard at his hated rival. "Boar's snout," he cried. "Boar's snout," Alfgeir repeated. The members of the Heart Lancers formed themselves into a tightly packed wedge-shaped formation, with Algar and Alfgeir forming the point. They locked their shields together and leveled their blunted spears. One of the members of the Bear Brothers heard the commotion from behind him and turned around to see the Heart Lancers preparing to attack. "Treachery," he screamed. "Too late." "Charge!" roared Algar, and the entire Heart Lancer surged forward into the cajoling crowd. The Bear Brothers were caught completely off guard. They couldn't believe their eyes. Their rivals were all defying the verdict of the Holmgang. This couldn't be. They would all be black-marked and branded as oath breakers. As Algar, Alfgeir and the rest of the Heart Lancers charged, swinging their wooden swords and spears, they were forced to admit that battle had been joined. The boys uttered their battle cries and did their best to get into formation. This was impossible as Algar had driven his wedge deep into their ranks. Every attempt to form a shield wall was broken up by the Boar's Snout, a formation specifically designed to break up enemy formations. The Heart Lancers roared as they charged, dividing the Bear Brothers into two. "Stop!" shouted Emmett. "Stop! Drop your swords! Halt!" cried Karla, his great voice booming like thunder above the tumult. "Halt!" It was no use. The boys wouldn't listen to them. The battle craze had taken hold, and nothing would stop them from taking their revenge. There were nearly 2,000 boys to only 30 adults. There was no way that so few could gain control of so many. Algar pushed on and on. He only had one goal: defeat Crest. That was the only thing he wanted. He didn't care about his honor, reputation, or any of that rot. The crows could have his good name if only he could pummel Crest and his followers into the dirt where they belonged. Vengeance. He roared, and that word became the battle cry of the whole Heart Lancer Fur. Crest looked on in bewildered horror. He knew that Algar hated him, but he didn't know just how much until now. He reached for his wooden sword at his side, and his blood went cold when he realized that it wasn't there. He had thrown it away along with his shield. The burning sensation of idiot shame filled his chest. How could he have been so stupid? Crest should have known better than to toss his weapon away. He was kicking himself for his lapse in judgment when Algar's wedge crashed full speed into him. Crest was bowled over, and it was all he could do to protect himself from the trampling booted feet that were stamping and stomping over him. Why did I think it was a good idea to attack Stygian's fasting? He thought as he curled up into a tight ball. A horn sounded and a cry went up. Save Crest. He's being crushed to death. It was Eric's voice. Crest was certain of that. At once the surging mass above him halted their advance. The sound of clacking wood and dinging metal could be heard over the din of shouts and cries. They're pushing him back. Crest realized as the boys who were standing above him began to move backwards. To confirm this, Crest heard a slew of curses being uttered by Algar. The leader of the Heart Lancers nearly tripped over Crest as Eric and the Bear Brothers pushed their way forward. Soon Crest found himself in the middle of a protective circle of his fur mates. Eric pulled him to his feet and handed him his own wooden sword. Algar's put his foot in it this time, snarled Eric. The nerve he's got. Defying the verdict of the home gang. I'll kill him for this. He'll get what's coming to him. Don't worry about that, old friend, Crest reassured him. Now what? Asked Eric. Crest looked around and saw that they were completely surrounded. Eric had halted the charge with 45 boys, most of whom were part of his tribe, the Tribe of Wolves. The blue-clad boys formed a circle facing outward, planted their feet and held their ground for all they were worth. Beyond the circle, Crest could see that any semblance of order had been destroyed. Both the shield wall and the wedge formation had been abandoned as the boys descended into a chaotic melee. Wild blows were struck, boys shouted and screamed. Somewhere in the din a boy could be heard weeping from either pain or fear. War horns were blowing nearly constantly. Banners and flags were grabbed and torn down by the enemy only to be liberated and reflown moments later. Then a new sound joined the fray, the fierce neighing and whinnying of ponies and horses. Several dozen boys from both sides had run from the battle only to return riding the braying beasts. They rode bareback, gripping their steeds by their long flowing manes. These riders charged recklessly into the brawl, bowling over several as they passed. Crest began to sweat as the hot sun beat down on him. He had only been in a few pitched battles before this one. Those bouts had been much smaller, only 300 fighters on either side at a time. But both he and Algar had had the majority of their fur present here. Crest tried to calculate how many young warriors were currently fighting it out around him, but gave up after a moment. Mathematics wasn't one of Crest's strong points. The exact number didn't matter. However many there was, it was too many. What else can we do? Said Crest, turning to Eric. We defend ourselves. Yes, obviously, snapped Eric, but what about you and me? How do we get out of here? Give me a minute and I'll think of something, replied Crest. Unfortunately, Crest didn't have any time to think. A great roaring cry was heard and both Crest and Eric looked up to see Algar. He was being lifted up on upraised shields, towering over his hated enemies. The leader of the Heart Lancers was covered in dust and sweat, his bare chest covered in bruises and bleeding welts. His dark eyes seemed to grow darker as he glared down at Crest. His wooden sword was now sheathed at his side, and in his hands he held a large wooden club, carved and fashioned into the likeness of an axe. With a cry that could easily be heard above the din, Algar leapt into the protective circle. The moment his feet touched the ground, he struck a mighty blow against Eric, striking him in his left collarbone. The red-haired boy had neither wooden sword nor shield to protect himself. As a result, he got the full force of the blow. He fell to the ground with a pained gasp and lay there, unable to move. Algar immediately turned his wrath against Crest. The battle fury had taken hold of him again. There was rage and murder in Algar's eyes. Crest saw that he intended to kill him. Come on then, Crest shouted at him. If he was going to die, then he was going to die standing. Algar howled as he swung his wooden axe. Crest brought up his wooden sword just in time to deflect the blow, but the impact was still tremendous. He tightened his left hand into a fist and punched Algar across the face as hard as he could. The blow barely affected Algar, who swung his axe in retaliation. Simultaneously, other members of the Heart Lancers began leaping over the protective circle, using their comrades' upturned shields as springboards. This particular tactic was known as hopping the hedge, and was generally used only by the most skilled fighters or the strongest berserkers. By doing this, they would be completely cut off once they jumped behind their enemies. A dozen boys had followed Algar, and each was just as skilled and as battle-crazed as he was. The Bear brothers, who were forming the protective ring, acted quickly to deal with this new threat. Several boys broke from the formation and turned to face the berserkers. Their comrades who remained in the circle did their best to fend off the enemies who pressed them all the harder. One of the blue-clad boys immediately rushed to Crest's defense. He smote Algar such a blow across his bare back that it drew blood. But once again Algar was too deep in his frenzy to feel any pain. He turned and smashed the boy across the face with his wooden axe. Had the boy not been wearing a cheek-hinged helmet, his jaw would have doubtlessly been shattered. In any event, he fell to the ground unconscious. Algar immediately returned his attentions to Crest. He roared and howled and screamed at him like a madman. Crest was terrified. He once again deflected a blow from Algar's axe, which had been aimed for his face this time. But instead of continuing to aim for his head, Algar swept Crest's legs out from under him. The leader of the Bear brothers landed heavily on his back, striking his head against the ground as he fell. His wooden sword was knocked from his grasp, and Algar was on him in an instant. He rose his axe over his head and brought it down with all his might. Crest's hand shot up and caught the heft of the axe, stopping its deadly descent in mid-swing. Algar tried to draw back the axe to strike again, but Crest refused to let go. He wrapped his fingers around the handle and held on for dear life, knowing full well that Algar would kill him if he did. A strange tug-o-war was fought between them. Both combatants were simultaneously trying to push the weapon away while trying to pluck it out of the enemy's grasp. Crest could feel his strength leaving him, his earlier bout having sapped most of it. His sweaty palms weren't helping him either. Both he and Algar could feel his grip slipping. But then salvation came to Crest in the form of Daniel. He had been swept up in the charge to save Crest and had found himself in the defensive ring that had formed around his new friend. When the hedge-hopping berserkers had leaped over him, he had been one of those who had turned to fight them. He had just smashed an opponent in the face with his shield when he heard Crest's desperate cry. He turned to see Algar on top of him. Daniel hesitated for a split second. Algar's bloodied back was facing him, and it didn't seem fair for him to take advantage like that. He remembered his father's words to him concerning fair play when he had joined his school's sports team. "It's best to treat everyone with respect, Daniel," he had said to him, "even if you think that they don't deserve it. You'll find that if you respect everyone, they'll treat you with respect in return. Perhaps not right away, but eventually they will. And you'll have more fun that way as well." Daniel smiled at the recollection, but then shook himself out of his nostalgia. His father's words were true, but they had been meant for sports like soccer, football, rugby and baseball. This wasn't a sport, this was a battle. Daniel gripped the hilt of his wooden sword and charged towards Algar. He raised his weapon over his head and cried, "Tally-ho," as loudly as he could. He brought down his sword on the crown of Algar's head. Berserker or not, that was a blow that he couldn't ignore. Algar toppled off Crest, holding his bleeding head in his hands. Daniel grabbed Crest by his vest and dragged him towards Eric, who was still lying on the ground, cradling his left shoulder. Crest was completely exhausted. His chest heaved as he gasped for air. "Are you all right?" Daniel asked him. Crest could only nod in reply. "Tally-ho," Eric managed to gasp through gritted teeth. "First thing that popped into my head," panted Daniel. He smiled down at Eric, but then he sensed something behind him. He turned just in time to see Algar rushing at him, blood trickling down his forehead and face. Daniel raised his shield and caught the blow just in time. He wasn't so fortunate with the second. Algar's axe caught him on the right wrist and knocked his sword out of his grasp. The next blow hit Daniel in the head, and his helmet rang like a bell from the impact. He fell, and Algar was on top of him, hammering him with his axe. Daniel was immensely grateful for both his helmet, chainmail, padded jacket and especially his shield. Algar's wrath and rage grew and grew with each whack. He recognized Daniel. He had been the one to foil his cattle raid and caused him to be captured. If it hadn't been for this damned human brat, he thought, I'd still be leader of my own fur. It's all his fault. His fault. His fault. Algar screamed as he raised his wooden axe over his head and swung it down with every last ounce of his remaining strength. Daniel raised his shield to defend himself. There was a loud crack as wood splintered. Algar's face went pale. His axe had broken in half. He gazed dumbfounded at the shattered heft. Daniel, likewise, was looking at his cracked shield which had broken in two. There was a momentary pause before Algar leapt on top of Daniel, knocking his shield away. The Arthurian boy threw away his ruined weapon and began pummeling his enemy with his bare fists. He punched and hit and punched again, not realizing that he was doing more harm to himself than to Daniel. Each time Algar struck, he tore his knuckles open on the metal rings or iron helm. Daniel could hear Algar's finger bones dislocating and breaking with each blow. "I have to get out of here," he thought as Algar planted his knee on his chest to hold him down. The Arthurian boy, now completely lost to his berserk rage, began punching Daniel in the face. He was either too tired or didn't care that Daniel's helmet was taking most of the damage. Daniel did his best to fend off the blows with his right hand while he grappled for his shield with his left. He grabbed the rim and swung it into Algar's side, connecting with his hip. Algar let out a pained cry and clutched at his side. Unknown to Daniel, a splinter over an inch long had just been driven into his opponent's flesh. Algar flopped back as Daniel sprang up and scrambled to get on top of him. Daniel gripped his shield by the rim and drove it into Algar's forehead once, twice, 3 times, bang, bang, bang. Algar stopped moving. Panting, Daniel looked down at him. He tossed his now bloodied shield aside and felt for the Arthurian's pulse. To his relief, he found it. Good, he thought as he got up, I didn't kill him. He staggered to his feet and saw that several of the boys had stopped fighting and were staring at him. Daniel felt his skin crawl. I didn't kill him, he said defensively. No? Asked Crest. Daniel shook his head. He'll probably wish you had when he comes to, grunted Eric. Looks like we're going to have to add another name to your title, said Crest, propping himself up on his elbows. Daniel Shield Basher, he concluded. More like Daniel Skull Splitter, spat Eric as he clutched at his wounded collarbone. Algar let out a low moan as he said this. Shut up. Both Crest and Eric shouted at him. Meanwhile, Myra, Asa and Tilla had taken refuge between Amaron's legs when the battle had started. They had been forced to release their ponies as they simply refused to be led anywhere near Amaron, who didn't help matters by licking his lips when he caught sight of the beasts. The youngsters took cover underneath the dragon and looked on in awe as the boys hammered away at each other. This was their first time seeing a fur battle, and it both thrilled and frightened them to think that all the fierce warriors who were currently battling around them were mere boys. If Arthurian children are this good at fighting, thought Myra, then what must their parents be like? They were shortly joined by Alfgeir, who wanted nothing to do with the trouble that would surely come of this battle. You should have stopped Algar before he ordered the attack. Tilla scolded him. My lady, Alfgeir replied, it would have been easier for me to stop an avalanche. You know what he's like once he makes up his mind to do something. Besides, our whole fur felt the same as he did. Do you really think this wasn't going to boil over into violence? You still should have tried to stop him. Continued Tilla. And I've told you that it would have been useless, snapped Alfgeir, you are a girl and don't know what you are talking about. War is the province of men, Tilla. You are neither a shield maiden nor have you ever held a sword before. Let those who know better have their say and remember your place. I have held a sword before, you Dritzek, snarled Tilla. There was a venomous edge to her voice that made Alfgeir take a step away from her. His face went pale as a half-forgotten memory from the back of his mind surfaced. I'm so sorry, my lady. I had forgotten about your mother, Alfgeir said in his native language, his head bowed and his hand over his heart. See that you remember that the next time you accuse me of never holding a sword before. Tilla replied in the same language. Neither Myra nor Asa had any idea what they were saying to each other. It was at that moment that Algar was defeated by Daniel and a shockwave seemed to pass through the boys. One by one they stopped fighting and collapsed to lie breathless on the grassy ground. A chorus of moans and groans and pained gasps began to fill the air as their wounds ached and throbbed. Tilla looked out over the field of battle and grimaced. She reached into her leather pouch, withdrew a handful of dried herbs and phials of sparkling fluids. She walked out from under Amaron to ply her skills. She knew that her supplies would run out long before she was done, but she knew that she had no choice but to act. Amaron looked down on the bloodied and battered boys and let out a rumbling chuckle. He chuffed smoke through his nostrils and peeled back his scaly lips to reveal his large sharp teeth. "Little fools," he snickered as he shook his horned head. He took a step forward, his immense weight causing the earth to tremble under his three-toed foot. He looked down at the groaning, moaning boys and chuckled again. "Look at you," he scoffed as he stepped over them, "you've bashed and battered yourselves senseless." The youths made no answer as Amaron strode over them. "And all for what?" rumbled Amaron, because one hot-headed boy couldn't keep his anger in check. "Tell me, oh great and mighty warriors, were the welts worth it? Are your broken bones, bruises, scrapes, aches and other pains enough to satisfy your apparent insatiable hunger for battle?" A few of the boys uttered low moans but said nothing else to Amaron. The great grey dragon snorted, blowing out jets of steam from his nostrils. He shook himself, once again rattling his dorsal spikes. "I thought as much," he grunted. The little whelpling walked beside him. He chirped up at him and Amaron halted. He glanced down at his nephew and nodded his head. The young dragon uttered an excited squawk and leapt into the air. He landed on his uncle's thigh, his grappling hook-like claws holding him in place. Amaron's thick scales kept the whelpling from drawing blood as he climbed up his leg. Once atop his flanks, the young dragon walked along Amaron's back until he was standing between his black horns. The little whelpling stood on his tiptoes to see as much of the battlefield as he could. He smelled the scent of sweat and blood which hung heavily in the air. It wasn't just those things that he could smell, he could sense the anger and fear that emanated off of the youths. It made him a little queasy. He snapped his jaws and squawked his disapproval. Amaron rumbled in agreement as the whelpling laid down along his snout.